The gas station stood alone on the edge of a forgotten stretch of highway where travelers' GPS signals faltered and maps refused to provide directions. The faded neon sign flickered erratically, casting a sickly green glow over cracked asphalt and a collection of rusted fuel pumps. It was the kind of place where even the bravest souls hesitated, their instincts whispering that something about this place wasn't right. Evelyn didn't have the luxury of choice. Her gas gauge had been on E for miles, and the nearest town was still hours away. She pulled her car into the station with a reluctant sigh, the tires crunching over scattered gravel. The moment she stepped out, the air grew heavier, thick with an unfamiliar metallic tang that stuck to the back of her throat. The station's windows were clouded with grime, obscuring the dimly lit interior. As Evelyn pushed the creaky glass door open, the tinny chime of an old bell echoed into the stillness. Inside, the air was stale, carrying a faint scent of mildew and something else. Something sweet yet sickly. Rows of dusty shelves held outdated snack bags and faded soda bottles, their labels peeling as if they'd been waiting here for decades. Behind the counter sat a man with a pale, waxy complexion. His eyes were sunken, his smile unsettlingly wide. He wore a greasy uniform with a name tag that read Dale, though the letters looked smeared, as though they'd been hastily scrawled in marker. "Evenin'," Dale rasped, his voice dry and cracked. Evelyn nodded curtly, her nerves prickling. Something about the way his gaze lingered made her feel exposed, as if he could see right through her. "Pump 4, she muttered, sliding a few crumpled bills across the counter. Dale didn't immediately take the money. Instead, he tilted his head, studying her. "You might want to hurry. Folks don't stay around here after dark." "Thanks for the advice," Evelyn said, forcing a tight smile as she backed toward the door. Outside, the light was fading fast, the sunset casting eerie shadows that stretched unnaturally long across the station's grounds. Evelyn began pumping gas, glancing nervously over her shoulder every few seconds. The stillness around her was oppressive, broken only by the distant hum of cicadas. As the tank neared full, Evelyn noticed movement in the corner of her eye. Across the street, a figure stood at the edge of the woods. It was too far away to make out any features, but the posture was wrong, unnatural, as though the figure's limbs had too many joints. It tilted its head at an odd angle, staring in her direction. She yanked the nozzle out and fumbled to replace it, her breath coming in quick bursts. Without looking back, she climbed into her car, turned the key, and nothing. The engine sputtered lifelessly. She cursed under her breath and tried again, but the car refused to start. Panicking, Evelyn grabbed her phone, only to find there was no signal. She glanced back toward the gas station and saw Dale watching her from the window. His face was eerily blank now, no trace of the earlier grin. He raised a hand and motioned for her to come inside. Evelyn hesitated, but staying in the car felt equally unsafe. She stepped out, her legs shaky as she made her way back to the station. The doorbell chimed again as she entered, but the sound felt louder, more jarring this time. "My car won't start," she said, her voice trembling. "Do you have a phone I could use?" Dale didn't respond right away. Instead, he gestured toward the back of the store. "Payphone's out back, but I wouldn't go there if I were you." Her heart pounded. "Why not?" Dale leaned forward, his face now mere inches from hers. She could smell his sour breath. "Because they like it back there." Before she could ask what he meant, a loud thud came from the roof of the station. Evelyn froze, her eyes darting upward. The sound came again, followed by a slow, deliberate scraping that sent chills racing down her spine. "Time's almost up," Dale muttered, backing into the shadows behind the counter. "You should have listened." The lights in the store flickered violently, plunging the room into intermittent darkness. Evelyn's instincts screamed at her to run, but her feet felt glued to the floor. The scraping on the roof grew louder, now accompanied by an unsettling, clicking noise that sounded too sharp, too deliberate. Suddenly, the front window shattered inward as something huge and grotesque hurled itself into the station. Evelyn caught a glimpse of elongated limbs and a grotesque, gaping maw before she bolted toward the exit. The creature let out a guttural screech that reverberated through her skull. She burst out into the night, the sound of pursuit close behind. In her panic, she didn't see Dale watching from the doorway. His unsettling grin returned, wider than ever. As she sprinted toward the woods, she realized too late that she had nowhere to go. The figure she'd seen earlier was no longer standing at the edge of the trees. It was now blocking her path. And then the lights of the gas station flickered out, leaving nothing but darkness and the sound of Evelyn's scream. The road had been a mistake. Tim knew it the second he took the turn off, but the detour sign left him no choice. A storm raged above, whipping rain against his windshield and blurring his vision. He hadn't passed another car for miles. The world around him felt deserted, as if the storm had swept away everything but the shadowy woods pressing close on either side of the narrow two-lane highway. Then he saw it. A gas station, glowing faintly through the downpour. The sight brought a flood of relief. His fuel gauge hovered dangerously close to empty, and the tension in his shoulders eased as he pulled into the cracked, waterlogged lot. The building looked ancient, its wooden siding warped and peeling from years of neglect. The only sign of life was the dim glow of a single fluorescent bulb in the station's office. No name, no brand, just a single pump and a grimy window smeared with raindrops. Tim stepped out of his car, shielding his face from the downpour, and approached the pump. He frowned. It was old, ancient even, with a rusted dial instead of a digital screen. When he lifted the nozzle, a sudden wave of nausea hit him. The stench of the gas was foul, more like decay than fuel. He dropped the nozzle and stumbled toward the office, his shoes splashing through puddles. The closer he got, the more he noticed peculiar details. The rain didn't seem to touch the building. It ran off in streams, avoiding the wooden boards as if repelled. And the light inside flickered, casting strange, jittering shadows that didn't seem to match the movement of the bulb. Inside, the air was suffocatingly warm, and the buzzing of a single overhead light drilled into his skull. A man stood behind the counter, his face pale and stretched, as if his skin was too tight for his skull. His eyes were glassy, unfocused, and when he spoke, his mouth moved too slowly for the words that tumbled out. "Need something?" Tim swallowed hard, forcing a smile. Yeah, pump 1. Can I pay in here?" The man tilted his head, the movement awkward, almost mechanical. "Ain't no one come here no more." Tim blinked. "Sorry? Not since the disappearances." Tim laughed nervously. "Look, man, I just need gas. My car's almost empty." The man didn't move, didn't blink. Then he leaned forward, his neck creaking like an old hinge. "You shouldn't have stopped." The words were barely a whisper, but they sent a chill down Tim's spine. Before he could respond, the lights in the station flickered, plunging the room into brief darkness. When the lights came back, the man was gone. Tim stumbled back, his pulse pounding in his ears. "Hello?" he called, his voice shaky. The room was silent except for the relentless hum of the fluorescent light. He backed toward the door, but when he turned to open it, he froze. The glass pane was smeared with handprints, dozens of them, pressed into the glass from the outside. They weren't there when he walked in. His heart raced as he yanked the door open and bolted toward his car. The rain seemed louder now, almost deafening, as if the storm itself was alive and angry. He fumbled with his keys, glancing over his shoulder toward the station. The figure was standing in the window, staring at him. But it wasn't the man. The shape was wrong, its shoulders too broad, its head too elongated. It pressed against the glass, and the handprints multiplied, spreading across the pane like an infection. Tim's car roared to life, and he slammed it into reverse, spinning out onto the highway. He drove blindly, the rain blurring the road as he sped away from the cursed station. His breath came in gasps, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. He didn't notice the fuel gauge. It still read empty, and no matter how far he drove, the station's faint glow never left his rearview mirror. A deep chill settled over the lonely back road, winding its way through an expanse of fog-drenched fields. Nathan didn't know why he hadn't stayed on the main highway. The detour seemed innocuous at first, a shortcut to save 20 minutes on his way home. But the farther he drove, the more the world seemed to bleed away into shadow and silence. It was nearly midnight when his headlights illuminated the first sign of life. A gas station sitting under a flickering street lamp. Its neon sign was shattered, leaving only the faint glow of exposed wires. The pumps were old, their paint chipped and rusted. Nathan pulled in cautiously, the sound of gravel crunching under his tires the only noise in the suffocating stillness. His tank was running low, and the thought of being stranded out here wasn't appealing. He stepped out of the car and looked around. The air was cold, unnaturally so for late summer, and smelled faintly of rot. The gas station looked abandoned, but the dim light inside suggested otherwise. Nathan walked to the door, pushing it open with a creak. Inside, the aisles were lined with dusty shelves filled with outdated snacks and cans of food long past their expiration dates. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed faintly, casting a pale, sickly glow. Behind the counter sat an attendant, his face half hidden by the shadows. "Evening," Nathan said, trying to sound casual. The man didn't respond at first. When he finally moved, it was slow, almost hesitant, as if he hadn't been expecting company. His eyes gleamed faintly, catching the light in a way that made Nathan uneasy. "Pumps pay inside," the man rasped. His voice was low and gravelly, as if his throat hadn't been used in years. Nathan handed over his card, noting the man's hands. They were filthy, the nails cracked and blackened, as though he'd been digging in the earth. "Traveling late," the attendant said, not looking up as he swiped the card. "Yeah," Nathan replied. "Long drive ahead." The man chuckled softly, a sound that didn't reach his eyes. "No one's driven past here in weeks." Nathan frowned. "What do you mean?" The lights flickered, plunging the station into momentary darkness. When they came back on, the attendant was staring at him, his expression blank, but his eyes filled with something Nathan couldn't name. "I'd leave while you can," the man muttered, almost to himself. Nathan didn't wait for an explanation. He grabbed his receipt and left, his heart pounding. The pumps whined as he filled his tank, the liquid trickling into the car with an unnervingly slow rhythm. He glanced back toward the station. The attendant was still there, standing at the window now, watching him. Behind the man, something moved. A dark shape, indistinct but massive, slithering across the floor. It wasn't human. It wasn't animal. Nathan's breath hitched as he watched the shadow rise higher, its form stretching toward the ceiling like a twisted marionette. The pump clicked, signaling the tank was full. Nathan yanked the nozzle free and jumped into his car. The station lights dimmed as he pulled out, leaving the building behind in the rearview mirror. But the unease followed him. The road seemed darker than before, the headlights struggling to pierce the oppressive fog that had rolled in. The air felt heavier, colder, and every now and then he thought he saw something in the trees. A glint of light, a flicker of movement. Then he saw it. In the distance, faint but unmistakable. The gas station. It didn't make sense. He'd been driving for 10 minutes, yet there it was again, its faint glow bleeding through the fog. Nathan's grip tightened on the wheel as he sped past it, the building receding into the mist behind him. But then, impossibly, it was ahead of him again, the same shattered sign, the same flickering light, the same attendant standing in the window, now smiling. Nathan's pulse raced as he slammed on the brakes, the tires skidding on the wet road. He climbed out of the car, trembling, and stared back down the empty road. There was no sign of a turn, no fork to explain how he'd looped back. From the gas station, a low hum began to rise, growing louder and deeper until the ground beneath him vibrated. The light inside the station flickered violently, illuminating the massive shape that now loomed behind the attendant. Its form was wrong, arms too long, its head split in two, revealing a gaping maw lined with jagged teeth. The attendant stepped outside, his movements eerily smooth, his eyes empty pits that oozed a black, tar-like substance. "I told you to leave," he said, his voice layered with something guttural, inhuman. Nathan bolted for his car, but the engine refused to turn over. Behind him, the humming grew deafening. The creature from the station advancing slowly, deliberately. Its limbs moved with a sickening crunch, bending in ways that defied nature. The last thing Nathan saw before everything went black was the attendant's grin, impossibly wide, as the creature engulfed him. The gas station remains on that lonely road, waiting for the next traveler to stop, waiting for the next mistake. The rain pounded relentlessly against the windshield as Emily drove down the desolate highway. The storm had come out of nowhere, swallowing the road in darkness and turning the night into an endless blur of water and shadows. Her hands gripped the wheel tightly as her eyes strained to follow the faint glow of her headlights, cutting through the sheets of rain. The fuel gauge dipped below empty. She cursed under her breath. There hadn't been a single sign of civilization for miles. Just as she began to fear she'd be stranded, a flickering light appeared in the distance, a gas station, barely visible through the storm. Relief flooded her as she pulled into the gravel lot. The station was old, its metal roof sagging under the weight of the rain. The pumps were ancient, their numbers faded and warped with age. The sign above the building had long since lost its letters, leaving only rusted metal where a name might have been. A single bulb above the entrance buzzed faintly, casting an anemic light. Emily stepped out of the car, pulling her jacket tight against the biting wind. She hurried to the door, the gravel crunching underfoot, and pushed inside. The bell above the door jingled softly. The interior was dim, the shelves sparsely stocked with dusty cans and faded candy wrappers. The air smelled stale, like mildew and motor oil. Behind the counter sat an attendant, his head tilted downward as he flipped through a battered magazine. His face was obscured by the shadow of his cap. "Hi," Emily called, her voice trembling slightly. "I just need to fill up. Can I pay here?" The man didn't look up immediately. When he did, his movements were slow and deliberate, as though he had just woken from a deep sleep. His face was gaunt, his skin pale and stretched tightly over his cheekbones. His eyes, dark and hollow, fixed on her with an unsettling intensity. "Pumps out back," he said, his voice low and raspy. "You'll need to turn it on manually." Emily hesitated. "There's no gas out front?" "Out back," he repeated, his gaze unwavering. She nodded, uneasy, and turned toward the door. As she pushed it open, the attendant's voice stopped her. "Don't stray too far," he said, his tone carrying a weight that made her stomach twist. "And if you hear them, don't look." She turned to ask what he meant, but he was already staring back down at his magazine, as if the conversation had never happened. Outside, the rain had worsened, hammering down in relentless sheets. Emily made her way around the side of the building, the beam from her flashlight cutting through the downpour. The back lot was little more than an overgrown patch of asphalt bordered by a dense line of trees. In the center stood a single pump, isolated and ancient, its paint peeling to reveal patches of rust. She approached it cautiously. A large switch on its side seemed to control the power. As she reached for it, a faint sound stopped her. It was faint at first, a low, distant hum, but it quickly grew louder, resolving into a discordant melody of whispers. Emily froze, her heart pounding. The whispers were coming from the trees, soft and breathy, their words unintelligible yet eerily familiar. She spun around, her flashlight darting through the woods, but there was nothing, just the swaying of branches in the wind. She shook off the chill creeping up her spine and flipped the switch. The pump rumbled to life with a groan. She hurried back to her car, eager to fill the tank and leave. As she pumped the gas, the whispers grew louder. They weren't coming from the woods anymore. They were closer, surrounding her, pressing against her ears. Her hands trembled as she turned, the flashlight beam catching the edge of the building. Something moved. It was tall and impossibly thin, its elongated limbs stretching unnaturally as it slipped around the corner of the station. Its face, or what should have been a face, was featureless, a blank, pale canvas that glistened like wet flesh. Emily's breath hitched as it turned its head toward her, as though it could sense her staring. She dropped the nozzle and bolted for the car. The whispers swelled, overlapping into a cacophony of guttural cries and hissing breaths. The thing was moving now, its grotesque limbs folding and unfolding as it dragged itself closer. Emily dove into her car, slamming the door shut. The engine sputtered once, twice, before roaring to life. She floored the gas, the tires spinning on the wet gravel before gaining traction. In the rearview mirror, the figure stood motionless, watching as she sped away. Relief washed over her as the gas station disappeared into the storm. But then she noticed something. The whispers hadn't stopped. They were still there, faint but persistent, coming from somewhere inside the car. Her blood turned to ice as she glanced at the rearview mirror again. The figure was sitting in the back seat, its head tilted toward her, the blank expanse of its face inches from hers. The last thing she heard was its whisper, "You shouldn't have looked." The night was impossibly dark, the kind of blackness that seemed to swallow everything beyond the reach of the headlights. Miles of empty road stretched ahead of Derek as his car hummed softly along the cracked asphalt. His GPS had died hours ago, and his phone was little more than a useless brick in his pocket. The only thing on his mind was getting somewhere, anywhere, that felt remotely safe. And then, as if summoned by thought, a faint glow appeared on the horizon. It was a gas station. Derek sighed with relief as he pulled into the lot, his tires crunching over gravel. The station seemed out of place, almost too pristine for its surroundings. The The pumps were modern, their screens glowing brightly in the darkness. The building itself was small but well lit, its fluorescent bulbs casting harsh, sterile light over a perfectly swept concrete floor. A hand-painted sign over the door read, "Midnight Market." He stepped out of the car, shivering as the cold air bit at his skin. The place was eerily quiet. No wind, no crickets, just the faint buzz of the fluorescent lights overhead. He tried the pump first, but the screen displayed an error message. "Pay inside." Derek glanced toward the station. Through the large glass windows, he could see rows of shelves neatly stocked with snacks and drinks. At the counter sat an attendant, their face obscured by a hooded sweatshirt. He hesitated, but forced himself forward. The door opened with a soft chime, and the warmth inside was immediate, almost oppressive. The air smelled faintly of disinfectant, mixed with something sweeter that Derek couldn't place. The attendant didn't look up as he approached. "Hey," Derek said, his voice cracking slightly. "Pump 4 isn't working. Can I pay here?" The hooded figure moved slowly, their hands sliding across the counter to press a single button on the register. A receipt printed out noiselessly. They tore it free and slid it toward him. "You're already paid," the attendant said, their voice low and monotone. Derek frowned. "I haven't paid yet. Are you sure?" The attendant nodded once, their movements stiff. "It's been taken care of." Derek picked up the receipt. The paper was blank except for a single phrase printed in small blocky letters. "Don't leave the lights." A cold knot formed in his stomach. What's that supposed to mean? The attendant didn't answer. They simply raised their head, and for the first time Derek saw their face, or rather the absence of one. Their hood was empty. No eyes, no nose, no mouth, just darkness that seemed to writhe and shimmer like oil under the fluorescent light. Derek stumbled back, his legs nearly giving out beneath him. The attendants stood slowly, their hands resting on the counter. "You shouldn't have come," they said, the words coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. Derek bolted for the door, his heart hammering in his chest. Outside, the world seemed different. The station lights still burned brightly, but beyond their reach, the darkness had deepened. It wasn't just night anymore. It was a void, pressing in on all sides, alive and hungry. He sprinted to his car and jumped inside, slamming the door shut. The engine roared to life on the first try, and he backed out of the lot in a frenzy. As he pulled onto the road, his headlights caught something standing at the edge of the light. It was tall, impossibly thin, with limbs that stretched too far and bent in ways that defied anatomy. Its head cocked to the side as it watched him leave, its faceless void tilting in silent curiosity. Derek drove faster, the station vanishing into the rearview mirror. He gripped the wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. But the light didn't follow him. As the car sped forward, the headlights began to flicker. The darkness outside grew thicker, pressing against the windows like it wanted to seep in. He flipped the high beams on, but they barely made a dent in the encroaching black. And then the engine sputtered. "No, no, no," Derek muttered, slamming his fist against the dashboard. The car jerked once, twice, before coasting to a dead stop. The headlights flickered one last time before winking out entirely. He sat in silence, while the blackness outside now absolute. The air felt heavy, suffocating. And then he heard it. A tapping sound, soft at first but growing louder, more insistent. It was coming from the window. With a shaking hand, Derek reached for his phone, using the dim glow of the screen to illuminate the car. The tapping stopped. He turned his head slowly toward the passenger side. Pressed against the glass was a face, or something pretending to be one. It was blank, featureless, just like the attendant's hood. But it wasn't empty anymore. From the center of the blank space, an eye opened, impossibly wide, unblinking. Then another, and another. They spread across the face like growing mold, each eye staring directly into Derek's soul. The last thing he heard before the world dissolved into screaming darkness was the sound of the car's radio crackling to life, a single distorted voice whispering, "You left the lights." The sky was pitch black, and the winding road ahead seemed to stretch forever into the void. Mia squinted through the rain-spattered windshield, the rhythmic slap of the wipers the only sound breaking the eerie silence. She hadn't passed another car in over an hour. Her phone's battery was long dead, and the fuel gauge hovered just above empty. That's when she saw it. A gas station sign glowing faintly in the distance. The letters were faded, but she could still make out the words, "Last Stop Fuel." The tagline beneath it read, Open 24 hours. Mia turned into the gravel lot, her tires crunching noisily in the stillness. The station itself was decrepit, the building sagging under the weight of years. The single pump looked older than her grandparents' first car, its paint flaking away in chunks. She stepped out, pulling her jacket tight against the cold drizzle, and walked toward the pump. A small sign taped to it read, "Pay inside first." With a sigh, she headed for the office. The glass door rattled as she pushed it open, and a bell above her jingled weakly. Inside, the fluorescent lights buzzed faintly, casting harsh shadows across rows of dusty shelves stocked with ancient snacks and faded magazines. Behind the counter sat a woman with a vacant expression. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her eyes were dull, as if they hadn't seen sunlight in years. She didn't greet Mia, didn't even blink. Pump one," Mia said, her voice shaky. The woman tilted her head slightly, her movements slow and deliberate. "You shouldn't be here," she said flatly. Mia blinked. "Excuse me?" The woman's eyes shifted, looking past Mia toward the door. "They'll smell you soon." Before Mia could respond, the lights flickered. In the brief moment of darkness, she heard something, a faint scratching sound like nails on metal. When the lights returned, the woman was gone. The counter was empty, save for an old cash register and a piece of paper. Mia stepped closer. The paper wasn't blank. Scrawled across it in jagged, uneven letters were the words, "Get out now." Her pulse quickened as she backed away. The scratching sound returned, louder this time, coming from outside. She froze, her heart pounding as she turned toward the door. Something was moving in the shadows just beyond the station's weak light. She couldn't make out its shape, but it was large, too large to be human, and its movements were unnatural, jerky and spasmodic, like a marionette controlled by an unskilled puppeteer. Mia stumbled back, her eyes darting to the aisles around her. Every instinct screamed for her to hide. She ducked behind a shelf, her breath coming in shallow gasps as the scratching grew louder, closer. The bell above the door jingled softly. Mia's heart stopped. Whatever was outside was now inside. She peeked through a gap in the shelf. A shadow stretched across the floor, impossibly long and thin. The thing moved slowly, its limbs scraping against the ground as it dragged itself forward. Its head turned, and Mia bit down on her hand to stifle a scream. The creature's face was wrong, a grotesque amalgamation of features that didn't belong together. Its eyes were hollow sockets, yet they seemed to see everything. Its mouth stretched unnaturally wide, revealing rows of jagged, yellowed teeth. It sniffed the air, its head jerking side to side like an animal catching a scent. Mia pressed herself further into the shelf, her back against the cold metal. Her mind raced. The woman's words echoed in her head. "They'll smell you soon." The creature let out a low, guttural growl, the sound vibrating through the small space. It moved toward the counter, its claws clicking against the tiled floor. Mia seized the moment, crawling toward the back exit she'd noticed earlier. She moved slowly, her limbs trembling, every creak of the floor beneath her knees sending waves of terror through her. The creature suddenly froze. Its head snapped toward her, its sockets narrowing. Mia bolted. She threw herself at the back door, her hands fumbling for the handle. It wouldn't budge. Behind her, the creature let out a deafening shriek, a sound so primal and otherworldly it made her ears ring. She turned, her eyes meeting its hollow sockets as it lunged. The last thing she saw was its gaping maw, impossibly wide, filled with rows of glistening teeth that seemed to stretch forever. The gas station still stands, its faint light a beacon for lost travelers. Sometimes, on stormy nights, you can hear faint scratching sounds in the silence. And sometimes, the bell above the door jingles, even when no one is there. The roads stretched endlessly ahead of Lucas, his car the only thing moving for miles. The stars above were hidden behind a thick layer of clouds, and the moon offered no light. The engine purred softly, but the loneliness of the drive pressed against him, a tangible weight. Then, out of nowhere, he saw it. A gas station. Its neon sign flickered weakly, casting a faint, intermittent glow onto the cracked pavement. Lucas didn't question its sudden appearance. He was running on fumes, and this station was his salvation. He pulled into the lot, his headlights illuminating the station's weathered facade. The building was small, its windows fogged and smeared, obscuring whatever might be inside. The pumps were old, their numbers faded to the point of illegibility. Lucas stepped out of the car, the air biting at his skin. It was colder than it should have been for this time of year. He shivered and approached the pumps, but the screen simply read, "Pay inside." The interior of the station was dimly lit, its shelves sparsely stocked with dusty bags of chips and outdated soda cans. A faint hum filled the air, the kind of noise that seemed to emanate from nowhere and everywhere at once. Behind the counter stood a man, or at least Lucas thought it was a man. His skin was pale, his face gaunt, his eyes sunken deep into their sockets. He wore a uniform that might once have been blue but was now a washed-out gray. His name tag read, Gary, in peeling letters. "Pump one," Lucas said, trying to keep his voice steady. Gary didn't respond right away. His lips parted slightly, his gaze unfocused, as if he were looking at something far behind Lucas. "You don't want to be here," Gary said finally, his voice flat and lifeless. "Excuse me?" Lucas frowned. "Not safe. Not tonight. Not tonight." Before Lucas could ask what he meant, a low sound rumbled through the station, a deep, resonant growl that seemed to come from beneath the floor. "What was that?" Lucas asked, his voice tight. Gary's head turned sharply, his neck twisting at an unnatural angle. "They're coming." "Who's coming?" Gary didn't answer. Instead, he reached under the counter and placed a single object on the surface, an old, rusted key. "If you want to live, take this, and don't look back." Lucas stared at the key, confusion and fear warring within him. But the growl came again, louder this time, and the ground beneath his feet trembled. He snatched the key and bolted out the door. Outside, the air was thicker, heavier, as though the night itself were pressing down on him. His car sat in the lot, its windows fogged over, the faint outline of his keys visible on the dashboard. He cursed himself for leaving them inside and hurried toward it. The growling noise grew louder, now joined by another sound, skittering like claws scraping against metal. Lucas stopped, his breath catching in his throat. From the shadows around the gas station, figures began to emerge. They weren't human. Their bodies were elongated, their limbs too thin and too long. Their faces, or what passed for faces, were voids, black and empty, save for wide, grinning mouths filled with sharp, gleaming teeth. They moved unnaturally, their limbs twisting and snapping as they crawled closer. Lucas fumbled with the key Gary had given him, unsure of its purpose, but desperate for it to do something. The creatures were circling now, their movements deliberate, predatory. He spotted a shed near the edge of the lot, its door locked with a rusty padlock. Without thinking, he sprinted toward it. The creatures screeched, their grins widening, their clawed hands reaching for him as he ran. The padlock clicked open with the key, and Lucas threw himself inside, slamming the door shut just as one of the creatures lunged. The shed was dark, the air stifling. He pressed his back against the door, his chest heaving as he listened to the creatures clawing and snarling outside. And then silence. He dared to hope they were gone. But as his eyes adjusted to the darkness, he realized he wasn't alone. In the corner of the shed stood a figure. It was human-shaped, but its proportions were wrong. Its arms too long, its neck bent at an unnatural angle. Its head tilted toward him, and in the faint light filtering through the cracks in the walls, he saw its eyes. Wide, unblinking, and filled with malice. The last thing Lucas heard before the darkness consumed him was the sound of the shed door creaking open. The gas station remains on that lonely stretch of road, its flickering sign a beacon for desperate travelers. But those who stop rarely make it back to the road, and those who do never speak of what they saw. The desert highway stretched endlessly, the horizon shimmering with heat, even though the sun had long since dipped below the jagged mountains. Jenna's car sputtered, the needle on the fuel gauge buried below E. She cursed under her breath, the oppressive silence of the desert making her feel unnervingly alone. Just as her car jerked and rolled to a stop, she spotted a faint glow in the distance. A gas station. She grabbed her phone, no signal, and stepped out of the car. The air was dry and unnervingly still. Not a single sound breaking the silence, except for her footsteps crunching against the gravel. The gas station loomed closer, its neon sign buzzing faintly, "Stop and go." The building looked old, almost abandoned, but the lights inside flickered weakly. The single gas pump was ancient, its metal casing rusted and its display cracked. A hand-painted sign taped to the pump read, "Pay inside first." Jenna hesitated, her gut screaming at her to turn back, but the vast emptiness of the desert offered no alternatives. She stepped inside. The air was stale, carrying a faint metallic tang that made her wrinkle her nose. The shelves were sparsely stocked with dusty snacks and faded labels, and the fluorescent lights overhead flickered erratically. Behind the counter stood a man. His back was to her, but he was tall, too tall. His shoulders hunched unnaturally high. His head twitched slightly, as if he were listening to something she couldn't hear. "Excuse me," Jenna said, cautiously, stepping closer. The man turned slowly, his movements stiff and deliberate. His face was off. His skin was too smooth, stretched unnaturally tight across his skull. His eyes were wide, glassy, and unblinking. "Pump one," Jenna said, her voice trembling. The man nodded once, his head jerking unnaturally as he reached for the register. His long, bony fingers tapped at the buttons with a strange, rhythmic precision. He handed her a receipt without looking at her. On the slip of paper, written in shaky handwritten letters, were the words, "Leave before they come." "What does this mean?" Jenna asked. But the man had turned his back to her again, his shoulders shaking slightly, almost like he was laughing or crying. The lights flickered again, plunging the room into momentary darkness. When they came back on, the man was gone. Jenna's heart raced as she stumbled back toward the door. Outside, the desert was darker than she'd ever seen it, the gas station's neon sign the only source of light. But something was wrong. The pump she had parked at was no longer there. Instead, the lot was filled with shadows that seemed to shift and writhe on their own, their forms almost humanoid, but not quite. They moved erratically, twitching and convulsing as they drifted closer. Jenna ran to her car, her hands fumbling with the keys as the figures approached. The air grew colder, the metallic tang from inside the station now overpowering. She glanced back. The shadows were closer now, their forms solidifying. She could see their faces, or the lack thereof. Smooth, featureless heads with gaping holes where mouths should be. And yet, they screamed, a piercing, inhuman sound that made her ears ring. Jenna's car roared to life, and she slammed it into gear, speeding away from the station. The headlights barely pierced the darkness, and in the rearview mirror, she could see the figures standing at the edge of the light, watching her. She drove for miles, her hands gripping the wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. But the road seemed endless, the desert stretching on infinitely. And then she saw it. The gas station. Its neon sign buzzed faintly. "Stop and go." Her breath hitched as she realized she had somehow come full circle. Her car began to sputter again, the engine dying as it rolled to a stop in front of the same decrepit pump. The figures were waiting for her this time, their smooth faces turned toward her, their mouths stretching wide in silent screams. Jenna's last thought as the darkness consumed her was that she should have listened to the warning. The gas station remains on that forgotten stretch of road, half a trap for the desperate and unwary. No one who enters ever truly escapes.